Hey there. Welcome to Shadow Archives. Just a heads up, there are a few ads in the first 10 minutes, then it's completely ad-free. I know many of you listen to these stories to relax or drift off to sleep. I hope you'll give this video a chance because I truly believe you won't find stories quite like these anywhere else. Before we begin, feel free to leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from tonight. And if you enjoy these stories, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Now get comfortable, take a deep breath, and let's begin. This happened years ago, but it's one of those stories that never really leaves you once you hear it. It's simple, there's no violence or crime, yet it's deeply unsettling in a quiet, personal way. The kind of thing that crawls into your mind and stays there because it breaks your sense of what feels safe and controlled. My brother was getting ready for bed one evening, following his usual routine. Nothing about the night was strange. No unusual events, no bad weather, no power outages, no chaos. Just an ordinary night in a normal house, the kind where everything feels predictable and familiar. That predictability is important because what happened later clashes so badly with it. My brother has always been extremely clean, not just tidy, but meticulous, especially when it comes to personal hygiene. He has always had strict routines around cleanliness. Growing up, we all noticed it. He would wash his hands more than most people. He paid close attention to anything that touched his mouth or face. If something fell on the floor, it was immediately considered contaminated. There was no debating it. He does have some mild OCD tendencies related to hygiene, though they've eased a bit as he's gotten older. But back then, he was very rigid. Toothbrushing wasn't rushed. Washing wasn't casual. Everything followed a system. Morning routines, evening routines, the same steps in the same order every single day. It was how he stayed comfortable, how he stayed calm. One of those routines involved his retainer. He wore it at night, and he took care of it carefully. Every morning, without fail, he washed it thoroughly. Not a quick rinse, but a proper cleaning. Then he dried it, placed it into a sealed plastic container, snapped it shut, and put it in the same place every time. That container stayed closed until bedtime. It wasn't left out. It wasn't exposed. It wasn't sitting near food or trash or anything unsanitary. That's what makes this story so hard to process. That night, he was getting ready for bed like always. Pajamas on, bathroom light on, everything quiet. He brushed his teeth, rinsed his mouth, and reached for the retainer case. He opened the sealed container and popped the retainer straight into his mouth without looking closely at it. Why would he? He trusted his routine. He trusted the system he had followed hundreds of times before. At first, he thought something felt off, just a strange sensation, something that didn't belong. His brain didn't immediately register danger or disgust. It was more confusion. Then he felt movement, not pressure, not discomfort, movement. Something inside his mouth started wiggling. That was the moment panic kicked in. He yanked the retainer out of his mouth instantly, pure reflex, his mind scrambling to understand what could possibly be moving inside something that was supposed to be clean, sealed, and safe. His heart was racing, his skin crawled, his stomach dropped. There are very few sensations more horrifying than feeling something alive in your mouth when you are not expecting it. When he looked down at the retainer, there it was. A giant maggot, not small, not barely visible. Big enough that there was no mistaking it for anything else. Thick, pale, writhing, alive, actively moving. It had been sitting inside the retainer. Inside the sealed container, inside something he put directly into his mouth. He froze for a second, just staring at it, his brain refusing to fully accept what his eyes were seeing. Then the disgust hit him all at once. He gagged. He nearly threw up. He dropped the retainer immediately, backed away from it like it was radioactive, and started rinsing his mouth over and over again, scrubbing his tongue, his teeth, everything. He was shaking. The rest of us came running, confused, trying to figure out what was going on. When he showed us, none of us could understand it either. We all stood there staring at that retainer and that maggot, trying to come up with some logical explanation that made sense, but there wasn't one. The container had been sealed. The retainer had been cleaned that morning. It hadn't been left out. There was no food residue. There were no other bugs. No obvious cracks in the case, nothing. The question that haunted everyone was simple and impossible to answer. How did it get there? Maggots don't just appear out of nowhere. They come from flies. That means at some point, somehow, a fly would have had to lay eggs either on the retainer or inside the container. But when? When the container was sealed? When it was drying? In the brief moments it was exposed, none of it made sense given how careful he was. And even if, somehow, impossibly, eggs had been laid, how did they survive cleaning? How did one grow that large inside a closed plastic case without being noticed? Without smell, without moisture, without air, there were no answers. Only questions. My brother didn't hesitate for even a second. He didn't try to salvage it. He didn't consider cleaning it again. He picked up the retainer with a tissue, sealed it inside a bag, and threw it straight into the trash outside. That was it. End of story. He was done with it. For days afterward, he was shaken. He brushed his teeth obsessively. He checked everything twice. He couldn't stop replaying the sensation of that movement in his mouth. The feeling stayed with him longer than the image did. That brief moment of something alive where it should never have been. Even now, years later, the story still makes people uncomfortable when he tells it. Not because it's graphic, but because it breaks trust. It turns something routine into something unsafe. It takes a daily habit, something mundane and controlled, and injects chaos into it. That's what makes it disturbing. It wasn't a dirty house. It wasn't neglect. It wasn't carelessness. It happened despite all the precautions. And that's the part that lingers. The idea that even when you do everything right, when you follow every rule, when you build routines to protect yourself, something completely unexpected can still slip through. Every time someone mentions retainers now, or sealed containers, or bedtime routines, I think about that night, about how something so small and disgusting could cause such a deep sense of violation, because that's what it was, a violation of personal space in the most intimate way possible. There was no lesson learned, no clear cause, just a story that ends with confusion, disgust, and the unsettling realization that sometimes there is no explanation at all, and somehow that makes it worse. My boss told me this story casually at first, like it was just something that had stayed with him over the years. But the more he spoke, the quieter the room felt. By the time he finished, I remember sitting there with this deep, crawling unease that didn't go away for a long time. It was one of those stories that doesn't rely on gore or chaos to be terrifying. It's scary because of how calm, patient, and planned it was. This happened back in the 1980s when things felt different in a lot of ways. Security systems weren't common, cameras weren't everywhere. People trusted that once they locked their doors, they were safe. But at the same time, certain areas were dealing with rising crime, and people learned to live with that constant low-level fear. My boss's brother was dating a girl at the time. They were young, happy, doing normal young people things. One night, he took her out on a date. Nothing unusual, just dinner, maybe a movie. The kind of night that ends with a smile and a promise to see each other again soon. It was late when he dropped her off at her house. Her parents were away for the weekend, which wasn't unusual either. She had stayed home alone before. Still, her father had always been very clear about one thing. He lived in an area that had seen a lot of crime, especially at night. Break-ins, assaults, things people didn't like to talk about openly, but everyone knew were happening. He had given her a simple rule. If you're home alone and something feels off, don't second-guess it. Don't try to be brave. Go to the neighbors and call the police. He told her that fear was not weakness, it was information. That advice saved her life. After the date, she said goodnight to her boyfriend and watched his car disappear down the street. The neighborhood was quiet, no shouting, no obvious danger, just darkness and silence. She unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The house felt empty in the way houses do when you're alone at night. Every sound seems louder, every shadow feels heavier. Still, nothing seemed wrong at first. She locked the door behind her, set her things down, and headed upstairs to her bedroom. She was tired and ready to sleep. When she walked into her room, she reached for the light switch. Nothing happened. The room stayed dark. At first, she assumed it was just a burned-out bulb. Annoying, but normal. Light bulbs go out all the time. She stood there for a second, hand still on the switch, waiting for the light to flicker on. It didn't. That's when something shifted inside her. It wasn't a loud alarm in her head. It wasn't panic. It was quieter than that. A deep, uncomfortable feeling that something wasn't right. The kind of feeling you can't explain logically, but that makes your stomach tighten. She didn't move right away. She thought about it. The light had worked earlier. She was sure of it. She hadn't had any problems with it before she left for her date. And yet, here she was, standing in complete darkness. She felt watched. That feeling alone could have been dismissed. People talk themselves out of fear all the time. They tell themselves they're being silly, that it's just nerves, that nothing bad is going to happen. But she remembered her father's words. If you feel uneasy, go to the neighbors. So she didn't try to fix the light. She didn't step fully into the room. She didn't look around. She quietly backed out, went downstairs, left the house, and went straight to a neighbor's home. She knocked on their door and asked to use the phone to call the police. The neighbors didn't question her. They let her in and made the call. When the police arrived, they took her concerns seriously. They went back to the house with her and began to search it carefully. They checked doors, windows, and rooms. Then they went upstairs. When they entered her bedroom, they looked at the light fixture. There was no bulb in the socket. It hadn't burned out. It had been removed. That alone was terrifying, but it got worse. The police continued searching the room, and when they opened the wardrobe, they found signs that someone had been inside, not long ago. Marks, disturbances, and evidence that a man had been hiding there, waiting for her. The plan was horrifyingly simple. The man had removed the light bulb so that when she entered her room and the light didn't work, she would step further inside. She would probably go to the dresser or the closet or stand on a chair to put in a new bulb. She would be distracted, focused on fixing the problem. That's when he would attack. He had thought it through. He had been patient. He had prepared. He wasn't acting on impulse. This wasn't random. This was premeditated. The idea of someone standing silently in a dark wardrobe, holding their breath, waiting for the sound of a door opening, waiting for the click of a switch, waiting for a moment of vulnerability, is enough to make anyone feel sick. If she had ignored that feeling, if she had told herself she was overreacting, if she had stepped into the room and reached for a new bulb, there is no doubt what would have happened next. She would have been attacked, raped, possibly murdered, and her parents wouldn't have been home. No one would have heard her. No one would have known until it was far too late. Instead, she listened to her instincts. The police never found the man that night. He had already escaped by the time they searched the house. That fact haunted her for a long time. Knowing someone had been that close, had planned that carefully, and had vanished back into the world without a face or a name. She lived. but she was changed. After that, she never brushed off fear again. She trusted it, she respected it. She understood that danger doesn't always announce itself with noise or violence. Sometimes it waits quietly in the dark. When my boss finished telling me this story, he said something that stuck with me even more than the details. He said the scariest part wasn't the man himself. It was how much thought he had put into it. The light bulb wasn't broken. It wasn't an accident. It was removed on purpose. That small detail shows planning, patience, a willingness to wait and watch and imagine what the victim would do next. That level of intention is chilling. It forces you to realize that some people don't act in moments of rage. They don't lose control. They don't snap. They plan. They observe. They prepare. And they rely on their victims, doubting themselves. That story changed the way I think about fear. We're often taught to ignore it, to be polite, to avoid seeming rude or dramatic, to assume the best. But fear exists for a reason. It's not always accurate, but when it appears without warning, when it feels deep and unshakable, it deserves attention. That girl survived because she didn't try to be brave. She didn't try to fix the problem herself. She didn't try to convince herself that everything was fine. She walked away and asked for help. Decades later, the story still makes my skin crawl, not because of what happened, but because of how close it came to happening, how easily it could have ended differently, how one small decision separated life from something unspeakable. Every time I think about it, I imagine that dark room, the silent wardrobe, the missing light bulb, and a man standing still, waiting for a moment that never came. And I'm reminded that sometimes the most terrifying dangers are the ones that almost succeed. My mother-in-law didn't tell this story in a dramatic way. The first time I heard it, she spoke calmly, almost casually, the way people do when they've had years to sit with something and don't need to raise their voice to explain how close they came to disaster. But the more details she shared, the more terrifying it became, because nothing about it felt exaggerated or sensational. It felt real in the quietest, most unsettling way. This was in the early 1990s, not long after a man named Kenneth McDuff had been released from prison. At the time, very few people knew his name. There was no internet the way we know it now, no quick background checks, no true crime podcasts or instant access to court records. If someone said they had been in prison, you might feel uneasy, but you didn't automatically know why. Information didn't travel fast, and a lot of very dangerous people were able to blend back into society because of that. My mother-in-law was working as a receptionist at a dental office in Rockdale, Texas. It was a normal job in a small town. She had 4 kids at home, responsibilities that kept her grounded and cautious. She wasn't naive, but she wasn't paranoid either. She lived the way most people did back then, trusting that if someone had been released from prison, the system had decided they were safe enough to be free. He came in as a patient. At first, there was nothing immediately alarming about him. He was polite, talkative, confident. But there was one thing everyone noticed right away: his size. She always describes him the same way. Not overweight, not sloppy, just massive. Tall and broad and muscular in a way that made him seem physically overwhelming even when he was standing still. He took up space. The kind of man you noticed the moment he entered a room, whether you wanted to or not. He started talking to her at the front desk during his appointments. Small talk at first. Comments about the weather, the wait time, ordinary things. Then it slowly shifted. Compliments, questions, personal interest. He asked her out. She said no. Not harshly, not accusingly, just firmly. She told him she had 4 kids. She wasn't interested. She kept it professional. She didn't want to provoke him, but she also didn't want to encourage him. He didn't stop asking. He asked her out several times over the course of his visits. Each time she declined. She later said that something about him made her uncomfortable, even before she understood why. It wasn't one specific thing, it was more like an instinctive resistance, the kind that doesn't come with a clear explanation but still tells you to keep your distance. He told her he had been in prison. He didn't say it with shame. He said it like it was part of a story he was telling about himself. He claimed he had been wrongly convicted, that he was innocent, that the system had failed him. He said he was writing a book about it, about his time in prison and how his life had been stolen from him. That kind of story can be persuasive, especially before the age of instant verification. People want to believe in redemption. They want to believe the justice system gets things wrong sometimes. And sometimes it does. But predators know exactly how to use that narrative to their advantage. She still said no. Not because she knew what he had done. She didn't. She had no idea he had been convicted of murder before. She just knew she didn't want him anywhere near her children. She kept things polite. She kept her distance. She stayed behind the desk. Then one day, something happened that made everything snap into focus. They were talking at the front desk, like they had many times before. Nothing out of the ordinary, at least on the surface. And in the middle of the conversation, he casually mentioned something about how her house looked from the street. Not her neighborhood, not her town. Her house, from the street. She felt it immediately. That cold, sinking feeling in the gut that tells you something is very wrong. She realized in that instant that she had never told him where she lived. Not her address. Not even a vague description. Or nothing. And yet he knew. That moment changed everything. She didn't confront him. She didn't ask questions. She didn't show fear. She did what a lot of women learn to do when they sense danger. She stayed calm on the outside and locked everything down on the inside. After that day, my husband remembers a clear shift in her behavior. She became strict in a way she hadn't been before. Suddenly, every movement was controlled. She wanted to know where the kids were going, who they were with, and when they would be back. There were no exceptions. Doors were locked at all times, even during the day. Windows were checked. Routines were tightened. At the time, my husband didn't fully understand why. He just knew that something had scared his mother deeply. She didn't explain it in detail. She didn't want to frighten her kids. She just acted. That instinct may have saved their lives, because only a few months later, the truth came out. The man was arrested again. This time, the headlines were unavoidable. The details were horrific. He hadn't just been a criminal. He had been a serial rapist and murderer. Women had been attacked, raped, and killed on back roads in the area, brutally, methodically, repeatedly. The man who had been flirting with her at the front desk. The man asking her out. The man commenting on her house. He had been hunting women. When she learned who he really was, everything fell into place. The persistence, the confidence, the way he ignored her refusals, the way he talked about himself as wronged and misunderstood, the way he felt entitled to her attention, and most chilling of all, the fact that he knew where she lived. She has said many times that she doesn't like to think about what would have happened if she had said yes even once, if she had agreed to a date, if she had been less cautious, if she hadn't had children to anchor her decisions. This is the part of the story that stays with me the most. She didn't avoid him because she knew he was a monster. She avoided him because she trusted her instincts. She avoided him because she felt something was off, even without evidence, even without proof, and that was enough. So many stories about serial killers focus on the dramatic moments, the violence, the arrests, the trials. But the truly terrifying part is how ordinary the lead-up can be, how close these people come to slipping fully into someone's life, how easily they can be mistaken for just another person, another customer, another man with a sad story. It's also a reminder of how much has changed and how much hasn't. Today, we have more information at our fingertips. We can search names, we can read court records, we can Google faces, but predators still rely on the same tactics: charm, persistence, playing the victim, ignoring boundaries, testing how much they can get away with. And women are still taught, often quietly and painfully, to listen to that inner voice that says something isn't right. My mother-in-law survived this encounter not because the system protected her, but because she protected herself. Because she noticed the small detail that didn't make sense. Because she didn't dismiss her fear as rudeness or overreaction. She didn't know she was dealing with one of the most dangerous men in the state at the time. She just knew she didn't want him near her children. Sometimes that's all the warning you get. When my husband talks about this now, there's a strange mix of gratitude and anger in his voice. Gratitude that his mother trusted herself. Anger that a man like that was ever released in the first place. Anger that he was free long enough to hurt more people. The story doesn't end with justice for everyone involved. There are women who didn't get away. Women who said no and were punished for it. Women who crossed his path and never came home. That's what makes this story so unsettling. Not just how close it came to one family, but how many others weren't so lucky. It's a reminder that danger doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it sits politely in a waiting room. Sometimes it tells you a story about being misunderstood. Sometimes it smiles and asks you out. And sometimes the only thing standing between a normal life and unimaginable loss is a single moment of realization, like noticing that someone knows where you live when they shouldn't. My mother-in-law still remembers his face, his size, his voice. She doesn't dramatize it. She doesn't need to. The facts are enough. She trusted her instincts. And because of that, her children grew up. Because of that, this story gets told as a warning instead of a tragedy. And every time I hear it, I'm reminded how important it is to listen when something feels wrong, even if you can't explain why. I still think about it sometimes. Usually when I least expect to. It doesn't come as a clear memory, more like a heavy feeling in my chest. A sudden reminder that the world can flip without warning, and that people you think you understand might be carrying something dark that never shows on the surface. This happened at my job, not somewhere sketchy or dangerous, just a normal workplace, the kind of place where people complain about shifts, joke around in the break room, talk about weekend plans, and count the minutes until lunch. Nothing about it felt threatening. Nothing about the people there made you feel unsafe. He worked there for 3 years. 3 full years of showing up on time, doing his job, talking to coworkers like anyone else. He wasn't loud. He wasn't aggressive. He didn't cause problems. He wasn't the kind of guy people avoided or whispered about. He was just there, a normal dude. The kind of person you nod at when you pass in the hallway. The kind of person you might talk to about something small and forget the conversation 5 minutes later. That's what makes this so hard to process. On one ordinary workday during his lunch break, he clocked out like usual. No one thought anything of it. People leave for lunch all the time. Some go home. Some go to fast food places. Some sit in their cars. It's routine, invisible. But instead of doing any of that, he went behind the building. Behind the building was not somewhere people really paid attention to. It wasn't a hangout spot. It wasn't a place anyone had reason to go. Just an empty area, quiet, out of sight. That's where he killed someone. He shot a man in the head. In no argument that anyone heard. No screams that anyone noticed. No chaos that spilled into the workday. Just one gunshot, or maybe something even quieter than that. Something that blended into the background of a normal afternoon. Afterward, he buried the body in a shallow grave behind the building. Then he came back inside. He clocked back in. And he worked the rest of his shift. That part is what breaks my brain the most. The idea that someone could commit murder and then just return to work, stand there, focus on tasks, answer questions, exist among people who had no idea what had just happened a short distance away. For the rest of that day, everything seemed normal. No alarms, no police, no lockdown, no one crying or panicking. People finished their shifts and went home. They ate dinner, they slept, they lived their lives. The body wasn't discovered right away. Days passed. During those days, he came to work like nothing had happened. He showed up, he clocked in, he did his job. He interacted with people the same way he always had. No visible cracks, no sudden change that made anyone stop and think, something is wrong here. Looking back now, people try to analyze it. They wonder if there were signs, if there were moments that should have stood out. But the truth is, there weren't, or at least not ones anyone noticed at the time. That's the terrifying part. Eventually, the police showed up. It wasn't dramatic at first. They didn't come in guns drawn. They didn't shut everything down right away. They were calm, professional, focused. They asked for his phone. He said no. That alone felt strange. Most people would panic or comply, or at least ask questions, but he refused. He didn't hand it over. The police already had a warrant. They searched the premises. That's when they found the body, behind the building, a kid. The word still sticks in my throat when I think about it. A kid, someone young, someone who had a whole life ahead of them, someone who didn't come home and whose family spent days not knowing where he was or what had happened to him. The discovery changed everything instantly. The workplace went from normal to horrifying in a matter of minutes. Police tape, officers everywhere, shocked faces, people crying, people standing frozen, trying to understand how something so violent had happened so close to where they worked every day. The realization spread fast. One of our own did this. Someone we knew, someone we trusted. Someone who had been around us for years. The police took him away. More details came out slowly, and each one made the situation worse. They searched his home. In his basement, they found phone books covering the walls, thick ones, the kind people don't even really use anymore. The police believed he used them for target practice, that he would shoot into them to stop bullets from passing through. The image is disturbing. Someone standing alone in a basement, firing into phone books, practicing, preparing, all while living a normal life on the surface. He pleaded not guilty. That shocked people too. Not because they believed he was innocent, but because the evidence felt overwhelming. The body, the timing, the location, the connection. It didn't feel like there was room for doubt. Still, he went to trial. In the end, and he was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. There was no dramatic confession, no clear explanation that made it all make sense, no final answer that wrapped everything up neatly, just a verdict, a sentence, and a deep, lasting unease. For me, the hardest part isn't just the crime itself. It's what it did to the way I see people. I knew him for years, not closely, but enough to recognize him, enough to talk to him, enough to feel confident saying he was normal. He wasn't angry all the time. He didn't threaten people. He didn't scare anyone. He blended in perfectly. That's what scares me the most. It forces you to accept that you don't really know anyone. Not fully, not the way you think you do. People can carry entire hidden lives inside them and never let a single crack show. After it happened, everyone started replaying memories, conversations, small moments. People wondered if they had missed something, if a strange comment meant more than they thought, if a quiet moment was actually a warning sign. But hindsight is cruel like that. It convinces you that the truth was obvious when it really wasn't. Life at work never went back to how it was. Even after the investigation ended, even after time passed, the building felt different. The air felt heavier. People avoided the back area. Some people quit. Others stayed but changed. Conversations became shorter. Trust became thinner. You'd catch yourself looking at coworkers differently, wondering what they thought about when they were alone, wondering what parts of themselves they never showed. It also changed how I think about violence. We like to imagine monsters as obvious, loud, angry, broken in visible ways. But sometimes they look like regular people. Sometimes they show up on time and work full shifts. Sometimes they smile and talk about normal things. And sometimes they commit acts that don't fit the image we have of them at all. I think about the victim a lot, about how fast life can end, about how someone can disappear from the world while everything else keeps moving, while coworkers finish their shifts, while traffic flows, while people make dinner plans. I think about his family, about the days they spent not knowing where he was, about the moment they found out the truth, about how nothing ever really heals from that kind of loss. And I think about how close it all was. It didn't happen in some distant place. It happened behind the building where I worked, during a lunch break, in the middle of a normal day. That's the part that sticks with me, the way horror doesn't always announce itself, the way it can exist right next to routine, right next to ordinary life. He was convicted. He's serving life. Justice, in the legal sense, was done. But the fear doesn't disappear with a sentence. It stays in small ways, in quiet moments, in the knowledge that the line between normal and unthinkable is thinner than we want to believe. I guess that's what scares me the most. Not just that he killed someone, but that for years he was just another guy at work. This happened only a couple of years ago, not in some distant place or distant time, but right where I live. That's part of what makes it so hard to think about. It didn't belong to another era or another world. It happened in a place that felt familiar and safe, to a kid doing something completely ordinary. He was a teenager, still in school, still living a life built around practices, homework, plans for the future. That day, he stayed late after school for tennis practice. Nothing unusual about that. Plenty of kids stay late for sports. Parents expect it. Coaches expect it. Schools are full of students coming and going long after the final bell rings. When practice ended, it was already getting dark. He walked out to the parking lot and got into his minivan. It was his family's vehicle. The kind of car that feels big and awkward but safe. A car meant to carry kids, groceries, sports equipment. Nothing dangerous, nothing threatening. He was getting ready to head home. At some point, he realized his bag was still in the back, the trunk area. So he did what almost anyone would do. He leaned over the back seat to grab it. No warning, no sign of danger, just a normal movement made 1,000 times by people everywhere. That's when everything went wrong. The seat tipped forward. Not enough for him to slip free. Not enough to fall all the way through, just enough to trap him. He ended up upside down, pinned between the folded seat and the trunk space. His head lower than his body, his chest compressed, his arms in an awkward position. Gravity working against him in a way he never expected. He couldn't move. At first, he probably thought it was annoying, maybe even funny. A weird position, something he could wiggle out of if he tried hard enough. People don't immediately panic in moments like that. Your brain doesn't jump straight to the worst outcome. But then seconds passed, then minutes, and nothing changed. His chest was being squeezed, not crushed violently, but held tight enough that breathing became harder. Each breath took more effort than the last. Panic started to creep in. Not as screaming fear, but as a growing awareness that this wasn't resolving itself. He was alone. No one else was in the parking lot. The school was quiet. Teachers and students had already gone home. The lights were off. The world had moved on for the evening, but he was still trapped. Somehow, despite being upside down and struggling to breathe, he managed to reach his phone. That alone shows how hard he was fighting. He couldn't call someone normally, couldn't explain what was happening in a calm, clear way. So he used Siri. He asked it to make an emergency call. The call went through. He reached 911. That should have been the moment everything changed. On the other end of the line was a dispatcher, someone trained to help, someone who hears fear every day, someone who is supposed to take every call seriously, especially when a caller is struggling to speak clearly. He tried to explain. He was trapped in his car. He couldn't breathe properly. He needed help. The details were probably fragmented. His voice was likely strained, breathless, confused. He wasn't in a position to give a perfect description of what was happening or where he was. A panic and lack of oxygen don't allow for clear communication, but help was dispatched. A police officer was sent to the area. The officer arrived and saw the minivan sitting there. From the outside, nothing looked wrong. No broken windows, no signs of a struggle, no person visible, just a parked car in a school lot after hours. The officer didn't look inside closely enough. He didn't open the doors. He didn't check the trunk. He didn't see the teenager trapped upside down in the back. So he left. That moment is one of the most painful parts of this story. The idea that help arrived, was physically there, and then walked away because nothing obvious stood out. It's the kind of moment that people replay endlessly afterward, asking what if? What if one more door had been opened? What if one more step had been taken? After the officer left, the teenager was still trapped, still upside down, still struggling to breathe. He tried again. He called 911 a second time. By this point, his voice was probably weaker, his breathing more labored, his thoughts less clear. Oxygen deprivation doesn't just affect the body, it affects the brain. It makes thinking slow, it makes speech harder, it makes everything feel distant and unreal. The dispatcher on the line didn't hear back from the officer. They had no confirmation that anything was wrong. They had already sent someone once, and that person had reported nothing unusual. So they decided the call was a prank. A prank. They stopped taking it seriously. They didn't send anyone else. They didn't insist on another check. They didn't stay on the line. And the teenager was left alone. Now, time passed in a way that must have felt endless to him. Upside down, chest compressed, lungs struggling, each breath shallower than the last, his body fighting to survive while his strength slowly drained away. Asphyxiation is not instant. It's not dramatic in the way people imagine. It's quiet, slow. The body becomes exhausted, muscles weaken, consciousness fades in and out. Panic gives way to confusion, then to nothing. He died there, in the back of his own car, in a school parking lot, after reaching out for help, after doing everything he reasonably could do. He didn't die immediately. He died over the course of hours. Hours where help could have come. Hours where one more check could have saved him. Hours where the system failed at multiple points. When his parents realized he hadn't come home, they were worried but not immediately alarmed. Teenagers are late sometimes. Practices run long. Friends stop to talk. Maybe he grabbed food. These thoughts buy time, and time was exactly what he didn't have. Eventually, worry turned into fear. They went looking for him. They found the minivan. They opened it, and they found their son. No parent should ever see that. No parent should ever have to discover their child like that, knowing how close help had been, knowing how many chances there were to stop it. The aftermath was devastating. Questions poured in. How could this happen? How could a call for help be dismissed? How could an officer miss someone trapped inside a car? How could a dispatcher decide a dying teenager was joking? There were investigations, reports, statements, explanations filled with technical language and procedure, but none of it brought him back. What makes this story especially haunting is how ordinary it all was. There was no criminal, no malice, no bad intention, just a series of small failures stacked on top of each other, each one seeming minor on its own, but together becoming fatal. A seat tipping forward, a car parked in a quiet lot, a voice on the phone that didn't sound right, an officer not looking closely enough, a dispatcher deciding it wasn't real. Each step small, each consequence enormous. It also forces you to confront an uncomfortable truth about emergency systems. They are built to handle patterns, to identify common scenarios, to filter out false calls. But when something unusual happens, something that doesn't fit expectations, people can fall through the cracks. And when that happens, the cost can be a life. This wasn't someone engaging in risky behavior. He wasn't doing anything reckless or illegal. He wasn't seeking danger. He was a kid getting his tennis bag. That's what makes it so hard to accept. There's also something deeply cruel about the role technology played. Siri worked. The phone call went through. The system activated. Help was technically summoned. And yet, it still wasn't enough. Modern tools gave him hope, but human judgment took that hope away. I think about what must have been going through his mind as time passed. The confusion, the fear, the disbelief that help hadn't come back yet, the effort it took just to stay conscious, the loneliness of being trapped in a space meant to carry you safely. Now, I think about how scared he must have been. I think about his parents replaying every detail, wondering if there was something they could have done differently, even though there wasn't. Wondering if they could have left later to pick him up. Wondering if waiting even one more minute to worry made a difference. Stories like this don't fade easily. They sit in the back of your mind and resurface in quiet moments. When you load something into your car, when you see a school parking lot at night, when you hear about emergency calls being ignored, they remind you how fragile life is, not just in dramatic moments, but in the ordinary ones. He should have gone home that night. He should have complained about homework or practice or something small. He should have lived. Instead, he died alone, upside down, in the back of his own car, after asking for help and not being believed. That's the part that stays with people the most. Not just that he died, but that he reached out, and no one came back in time. There are some stories that don't feel like stories at all. They feel like wounds that never closed. This is one of those. Even retelling it feels wrong somehow, like putting words around something that should never have happened in the first place. But it happened. And the only thing worse than the act itself is how easily a life like hers was allowed to slip through every crack. She was 5 years old. 5 is the age where children still believe the world is mostly safe, where danger doesn't exist unless an adult names it for them, where home is supposed to mean protection, not something you need protection from. She didn't have that. She lived with her mother, a woman people whispered about. No one could ever quite prove anything, but everyone seemed to know something was wrong. Neighbors talked, family members talked. People said the mother was neglectful, sometimes abusive, and always eager to get rid of the child whenever she could. If there was an excuse to send her somewhere else, she took it. If there was a way to make the girl someone else's responsibility, even for a few hours, she used it. The child learned early that she was an inconvenience. That alone does something terrible to a child. When you grow up feeling unwanted, you stop asking for help. You stop trusting that someone will show up for you. You learn to be quiet, to go along, to obey. And predators know exactly how to sense that kind of vulnerability. One day, her mother sent her to her grandmother's apartment. On the surface, this didn't seem unusual. Grandparents babysit, children visit relatives. Nothing about the plan raised alarms, at least not officially. But this wasn't a loving visit. It was another chance for the mother to be free of her daughter for a while. The grandmother lived in an apartment building, a place where people came and went, where doors were close together, where strangers weren't really strangers at all. Adults passed each other in hallways without looking too closely. Children played outside without much supervision because everyone assumed someone else was watching. The girl arrived at her grandmother's place and, at some point, went outside to play. She was alone, 5 years old and alone. No adult following her, no one checking in, no one making sure she stayed close or stayed safe. Just a small child in a world that already had too many people willing to hurt someone like her. That's when he saw her. He was 37 years old, though old enough to know exactly what he was doing, old enough to understand the consequences, old enough that no one could ever pretend this was confusion or a mistake or a moment of lost control. He was a neighbor, someone familiar enough to not immediately trigger fear, someone who belonged there, someone whose presence didn't stand out. He didn't have to grab her. He didn't have to chase her. He used words instead. He lured her into his apartment. A child that age doesn't understand manipulation. When an adult speaks confidently, when they sound friendly, when they act like they belong, children listen, they follow, especially children who have learned that adults control their lives and that saying no rarely leads to safety. Once inside, the door closed. What happened next is unbearable to think about, even without details. She was beaten. She was violated in ways no human being should ever experience, let alone a child. Her body was treated like an object. Her pain didn't matter. Her fear didn't matter. Her life didn't matter to him at all. At some point, he strangled her, but not enough to kill her. That detail is one of the most horrifying parts of this story. The fact that she didn't die right away. The fact that her body kept fighting to live even after everything she had endured. The fact that her heart kept beating when it never should have had to endure another second of suffering. He put her into a gym bag, a bag meant for clothes, for shoes, for ordinary things. He folded her small body into it like she was nothing more than something to be carried and discarded. Then he left. He didn't panic. He didn't hide. Yeah, he didn't run through back streets or act like someone who had just destroyed a life. He took public transportation, a bus. He sat among other people, people going about their day, people who had no idea that a child was zipped into a bag nearby, struggling, breathing, alive. That image alone is almost impossible to process. A bus ride is such a normal thing. People stare out windows, they check their phones, they complain about traffic, and all the while, a 5-year-old girl was trapped, injured, terrified, and still alive. He went to the beach, he walked to the water, and he threw the bag into the ocean, not caring if she was alive or dead, not caring about anything at all. For a while, no one knew what had happened to her. She was just gone. Another child who didn't come home. In another disappearance that people would later analyze for warning signs and missed chances. Her mother, her grandmother, neighbors, authorities, all piecing together timelines too late to matter. When the gym bag was finally found, it was already too late. The truth came out slowly, and when it did, it was worse than anyone could have imagined. The medical examination revealed something that still makes people feel sick to their stomachs. She had been alive when she entered the water. She didn't die from the beating. She didn't die from the strangulation. She drowned. That means that after everything else, after the pain, after the terror, after being zipped into a bag and thrown away, she was still alive long enough to feel water fill her lungs, long enough to fight for air, long enough to experience the final, an unimaginable fear of drowning alone. 5 years old. There is no justification, no explanation, no context that makes this make sense. It is cruelty in its purest form. But what makes this story even harder to sit with is that it wasn't just one man who failed her. He committed the act. He is responsible. But the system around her failed long before that day. She lived with a neglectful mother who didn't protect her. She was allowed to wander alone at an age where supervision should have been constant. She lived in a building where no one noticed or no one acted. There were rumors, there were whispers, there were signs, but nothing strong enough, loud enough, or urgent enough to save her. And afterward, people asked the same questions they always ask. Why was she alone? Why didn't someone notice? Why didn't someone intervene sooner? Why is it always after the worst has already happened that concern becomes loud and visible? The man was caught. He was charged. He will spend the rest of his life defined by what he did. That part of the story is clear and straightforward in a way the rest of it isn't. But punishment doesn't equal justice. Justice would have been her growing up. Justice would have been her getting older, going to school, making friends, having favorite foods and favorite songs. Justice would have been a life where she was protected, valued, and loved. None of that happened. Instead, she became another name added to a list of children failed by neglect, by indifference, and by systems that react instead of prevent. People often talk about monsters like they're rare, obvious, and easy to spot. But monsters don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they look like neighbors. Sometimes they live next door. Sometimes they blend into everyday life so well that no one notices until it's too late. And sometimes the most dangerous thing a child can have is no one paying close enough attention. This story stays with people not just because of what happened, but because of how preventable it feels in hindsight. A little supervision, a little care, one adult who decided to truly watch over her. Any one of those things could have changed the outcome. Instead, she was alone in the moments when she needed protection the most. 5 years old is too young to understand evil, too young to defend yourself, too young to survive something like that. When people remember her now, they often focus on the brutality of her death. But she was more than the way she died. She was a child who deserved safety and didn't get it. A child whose life was defined not by who she was, but by how badly adults failed her. And that's the part that lingers. Not just the crime itself, but the quiet realization that there are children right now living in similar conditions. Children who are neglected, unseen, unprotected. Children who rely on adults to notice when something is wrong. This story is horrifying because it happened, but it's terrifying because it could happen again. And the only thing that can stop it is not just punishment after the fact, but attention before it's too late. Pardon the brief pause in our journey. If this is your first time listening, I'm glad you found us. If you want to keep these rainy nights and calm stories going, please subscribe to Shadow Archives. Think of it as keeping the lights low and the stories moving. Make sure to tap the bell so you never miss a moment of the dark. And now, let's return to where we left off. For several days before anything actually happened, the family noticed small things that felt wrong but were easy to dismiss. A car that seemed to appear too often. 2 men who showed up in places that didn't make sense. At first, it felt like coincidence. Cheshire was a quiet town. Safe. The kind of place where families didn't expect danger to follow them home. The family of 4 lived a normal life. The parents were devoted to each other, deeply involved in their daughters' lives, and focused on giving them stability and love. Their home was not hidden or isolated, but it felt secure. Nothing about their daily routine suggested that someone was watching, planning, waiting, but they were. 2 men had been tracking the family for days. They studied their schedule, their habits, the layout of the house. They knew when the parents left. So when the girls came home, and when the house went quiet at night. This was not random violence. It was deliberate, patient, calculated. The night it began quietly. There was a knock at the door. Not loud, not aggressive, just enough to make the father pause and wonder who could be there so late. When he opened the door, he never had a chance. He was attacked immediately, struck hard, knocked unconscious before he could understand what was happening. The two men moved quickly after that. They forced their way inside the house, controlling the space with calm efficiency. The mother and the two daughters were restrained. The girls were terrified, confused, barely able to process what was unfolding. The mother tried to stay calm for them, even as fear set deep into her chest. The father was tied up in another room, injured and helpless, unable to see what was happening to his family. He could hear them, though. Every sound carried through the house. Every moment passed slowly, painfully. The night dragged on. The intruders stayed. They were not in a hurry. This was not a burglary gone wrong. This was something much worse. When morning came, the situation shifted in a way no one expected. The men forced the mother to leave the house with them. They drove her to several banks, demanding she withdraw money. She did what they told her to do, step by step, holding herself together the only way she could. She knew her husband and daughters were still trapped at home. Every decision she made was driven by one hope. If she cooperated, maybe they would leave. At one of the banks, a teller noticed something was wrong. The woman looked frightened, controlled, not free. The teller asked her quietly if she needed help. It was the moment that could have changed everything. The mother said no. She told them the men would go away. She did not ask for help. It wasn't because she didn't want it. It was because she believed that any wrong move could cost her daughters their lives. By this point, the police already knew something was happening. Law enforcement had become aware of the situation and had surrounded the house from a distance. They knew there were hostages inside. They knew armed men were involved. But they chose not to act. Their reasoning was that moving in could make things worse. They decided to wait. The house was effectively locked down, watched, monitored, but untouched. Time kept passing. The mother was eventually brought back home. She walked back into the house knowing what might happen next. She did not know the police were already there, watching from afar. She did not know if anyone was preparing to help. Inside the house, the situation became even more horrific. The daughters were attacked while their father remained bound in another room, unable to reach them, unable to stop what was happening, forced to hear everything. The mother was also attacked. The violence was deliberate and cruel, carried out with no regard for human life. The police still did nothing. This continued while officers remained nearby, aware of the hostage situation, waiting for a moment that never seemed to come. Eventually, the mother was murdered. At some point during the chaos, the father managed to break free from his restraints. Injured, desperate, and terrified, but he escaped the house and ran to a neighbor's home for help. He had no idea that the police were already there. He only knew that his family was in danger and that he had to do something. When the attackers realized the father had escaped, everything escalated. They turned their violence on the two daughters and killed them. Only after the father made contact with authorities did the police finally move in. By then, it was too late. The entire ordeal lasted nearly 2 days. 2 days of fear, 2 days of suffering, 2 days in which law enforcement had knowledge of what was happening and chose not to intervene. The decisions made during those hours would be questioned for years. Why didn't they act sooner? Why was no rescue attempt made? Why was waiting seen as safer than saving lives? There were no answers that could undo what happened. The town was shattered. A family had been erased in the most brutal way imaginable. Neighbors struggled to understand how something like this could happen in a place they believed was safe. People demanded accountability. Investigations followed. Reports were written. Mistakes were acknowledged in quiet, careful language, but nothing brought the family back. The husband survived. Physically, he healed. Emotionally, the damage was permanent. He had lost his wife. He had lost both daughters. He had lived through something no one should ever experience, knowing that help was nearby but did not come. For a long time, he lived with grief, anger, and guilt. Survivor's guilt. The kind that doesn't fade with time. The kind that asks impossible questions with no answers. Eventually, life continued because it had to. He remarried. He had another child. Not as a replacement, never that, but as a way forward. A way to hold on to life instead of being buried by loss. But he did not forget. Instead of turning away from the system that failed him, he chose to confront it. He became involved in his community, determined to make sure that no other family would ever be left waiting while danger unfolded in real time. He ran for town selectman in Cheshire, Connecticut, not for power, not for recognition, but for accountability. He wanted to make sure that policies changed, that law enforcement would never again stand by during a hostage situation without taking action. That hesitation would not be allowed to cost lives. His story became a reminder that evil does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it watches quietly, sometimes it waits, and sometimes, the greatest tragedy is not just the crime itself, but the moments when help was close enough to act and didn't. The Cheshire murders remain one of the most disturbing cases, not only because of what was done, but because of what wasn't done. A family suffered for hours while the system designed to protect them chose to wait. And the cost of that waiting was everything. Angela Hammond was 20 years old, full of plans and deeply loved. She lived in Clinton, Missouri, a town where people recognized familiar faces and routines felt safe. She worked at a bank, attended classes at Central Missouri State University, and had the kind of life that seemed to be moving forward in a steady, hopeful direction. Friends described her as popular and kind, someone who was easy to be around and easy to care about. She was engaged to Rob Schaefer, an athlete who planned to join the military. They were young but serious about their future. They talked about marriage, about life, about everything that still felt possible. In January of 1991, Rob proposed. Angela said yes. It was the kind of engagement that felt joyful and certain, not rushed or dramatic, just two people choosing each other. They were the kind of couple people expected to grow old together. Nothing about their lives suggested how violently that future would be taken away. On April 4th, 1991, the night started out ordinary. Angela and Rob had spent time together at a barbecue. At around 10 o'clock that night, Angela drove Rob back to his house. He needed to stay home for a while because he was babysitting his younger brother until his mother returned from work. The plan was simple. Once Rob's mom got home, Angela and Rob would meet up again later that night. It wasn't a goodbye, it was just a pause. After dropping Rob off, Angela spent some time with her friend Kyla. They talked, hung out, did what young people do late at night when there's no sense yet that anything bad could happen. Eventually, Angela decided to call Rob. This was before cell phones were common. If you wanted to call someone while you were out, you used a payphone. At around 11:15 p.m., Angela stopped at a payphone at the intersection of Jefferson and 2nd Street in Clinton. It was only 7 blocks from Rob's house, close enough to feel safe, close enough that help didn't feel far away. She called Rob, and he answered. While they were talking, something started to feel wrong. Angela noticed a man in a green Ford pickup truck driving around the block. Not once, not twice, several times. He wasn't just passing through, he was circling, watching. She mentioned it to Rob as they talked. At first, it was just an observation, but the longer it went on, the more uneasy she became. Eventually, the truck pulled up beside her. The man got out. He walked over to the payphone near her and pretended to use it. He didn't say anything threatening. He didn't touch her. He just stood there close enough to make her uncomfortable. After a moment, he got back into his truck. Then he took out a flashlight and began shining it around the inside of the truck, as if he were looking for something he had dropped. Angela described all of this to Rob in real time. She told him about the man, about the truck, about the flashlight. She was alert. She was paying attention. She wasn't panicking yet, but she knew something wasn't right. Rob listened carefully, trying to stay calm on the other end of the line. Angela did something thoughtful and polite, something that now feels heartbreaking. She asked the man if he needed to use the phone. She was trying to be kind, trying to be normal. The man replied that he would try the other phone again in a minute. There was nothing openly aggressive in his words, nothing that would have justified calling the police right away, at least not in the moment. Angela and Rob continued talking. Just seconds later, everything changed. Rob suddenly heard Angela scream, not a startled sound, not confusion, a scream of pure terror. Immediately after that, Rob heard the man's voice come through the phone. Calm, cold, almost casual. He said, "I didn't need to use the phone anyway." That sentence has haunted people for decades. The cruelty of it, the certainty, the fact that he knew exactly what he was doing. Rob dropped the phone and ran outside. He didn't stop to think. He didn't hesitate. He jumped into his car and drove toward the payphone as fast as he could. His only thought was getting to Angela, helping her, saving her. As he sped through the streets, the green pickup truck came toward him in the opposite direction. In that moment, Rob heard Angela's voice again. She was yelling, calling out to him. She was alive. She was still fighting. Rob slammed his car into reverse, trying to turn around as quickly as possible. In the panic and urgency of the moment, he damaged his transmission. He didn't know that yet. He only knew he had to follow that truck. He chased it. For 2 miles, Rob stayed behind the green pickup, pushing his car as hard as he could. His heart must have been racing. Every second probably felt like both hope and dread tangled together. He was close, so close. Close enough that this shouldn't have ended the way it did. Then, as he made a sharp right turn, his car failed. The damaged transmission finally gave out. His vehicle stopped responding. The truck kept going. And just like that, Angela Hammond was gone. The green Ford pickup disappeared into the night and was never seen again. Angela was never found. There was no body, no confirmed crime scene beyond the payphone, no physical evidence that could lead investigators to a clear suspect. What remained were Rob's account, Angela's last words, and the chilling voice of a man who knew he had just taken someone's life away from the world. For Rob, the trauma didn't end that night. In many ways, it began there. Imagine arriving just in time to see the person you love being taken. Imagine hearing their voice, knowing they are alive and still being unable to reach them. Imagine chasing them with everything you have, yet only to be stopped by something as small and cruel as a broken car. That kind of helplessness doesn't fade. Rob lived with the knowledge that he was there, that he heard it happen, that he almost made it. Survivors of situations like this often carry an unbearable weight of guilt, even though they did nothing wrong. The mind replays moments endlessly, searching for a different outcome that never existed. What if he had left the house sooner? What if the car hadn't failed? What if the police had been closer? What if someone else had been nearby? There are no answers that bring peace. The case drew national attention, but attention didn't bring resolution. Witnesses came forward over time. Some claimed to have seen a green pickup. Others thought they recognized a man who matched the description Angela gave to Rob. Tips were called in. Leads were followed. None of them led to Angela. Years passed, then decades. Angela's family never got answers. No explanation, no certainty, just absence. The kind of absence that doesn't close because without proof of death, Hope refuses to fully disappear, and hope can be as painful as grief when it never resolves. For Rob, life moved forward because time doesn't stop, even when people want it to. But nothing about his life was untouched by that night. The sound of Angela's scream, the man's words, the sight of the truck speeding away, those memories became permanent. This case is especially devastating because of how close help was. Angela did everything right. She paid attention to her surroundings. She described the man and his truck. She stayed on the phone with someone she trusted. She didn't wander off. She didn't ignore her instincts, and still, it wasn't enough. It also shows how quickly danger can appear in places that feel safe. A small town, a well-lit intersection, a phone call to a fiancé just blocks away. Evil didn't arrive loudly. It arrived quietly, patiently, circling the block until the moment was right. The man who took Angela didn't panic. He didn't rush. He tested the situation. He watched. He waited. And when he acted, he did so with confidence, even arrogance. His comment after abducting her suggests someone who believed he would get away with it. And so far, he has. Angela Hammond's disappearance remains one of those cases that feels unbearably unfinished. Not because the story lacks detail, but because it has no ending. There is no grave to visit, no final truth to accept. Just a moment frozen in time, replayed over and over. For people who hear this story, the hardest part is often imagining Rob's position, loving someone, hearing their fear, running toward them, seeing them vanish anyway. It forces you to confront how fragile control really is, how sometimes, even when you do everything you can, the outcome is still stolen from you. Angela should have gone home that night. She should have married Rob. She should have lived the life she was planning. Instead, she became a name spoken in true crime stories, a photograph frozen at 20 years old, a voice that vanished mid-conversation. Her story is not just about a kidnapping. It's about loss that has no closure, about the cruelty of timing, about how love can be present in the final moments and still not be enough to stop tragedy. And for Rob, it's about living with the echo of a scream he could never forget, and the knowledge that he arrived just seconds too late. That kind of pain doesn't fade. It just becomes part of who you are. I've thought about this story for most of my life, even when I didn't have the words to understand what it really meant. When I was younger, it lived in my mind like a strange, uncomfortable memory. As I got older, it changed into something heavier, something that sits with me no matter how much time passes. My mom grew up in extreme poverty, the kind of poverty that isn't just about not having money, but about lacking safety, stability, and choices. She was one of the lucky ones. When she was 15, she managed to get away. She met my dad, built a life, and gave me a childhood that, compared to hers, was privileged. I never went hungry. I had clean clothes. I had adults who cared about me. But her family was still there. We still went back to visit. Every time we visited my mom's side of the family, it felt like stepping into a different world. The roads were rough. The houses were old and falling apart. Everything felt heavier, slower, like life itself was harder to move through there. My grandmother lived in an old schoolhouse that had been converted into living spaces. She rented out what she called apartments to other families. In reality, they were small, cramped rooms carved out of a building that had long outlived its purpose. To me, as a kid, it was strange but also exciting. There was land to run on, woods to explore, no rules the way there were back home. It felt like freedom. That's where I met her. She lived in one of the apartments my grandmother rented out. She was about my age, maybe a year or two different, but close enough that it didn't matter. From the moment we met, we clicked. She was kind, bright, and full of imagination. She had this energy about her that pulled you in. When she talked, you listened. When she played, you followed. She was the leader. Every time I visited, we would play together. We ran through the yard and into the woods behind the schoolhouse. We pretended we were explorers discovering new lands. She named places, made up stories, gave us missions. I remember thinking she was amazing, creative, brave. I really, really liked being with her. Those memories are still warm. For years, whenever we went back, I looked forward to seeing her. It didn't matter that our lives were completely different. When we were together, none of that existed. We were just kids, running and laughing and imagining worlds where everything was better. One night, when I was around 10 years old, she invited me over for dinner. I didn't ask permission. I didn't think I needed to. In my mind, it was innocent, just two kids having dinner together. I followed her to her apartment without telling anyone. I didn't know that I was walking into something that would stay with me forever. The moment I stepped inside, everything changed. The smell hit me first. It was overwhelming, rotten, sour, like decay. The floor was covered in thick, dark gunk that looked like it had been there for years. It stuck to your shoes. The walls were stained. The air felt heavy, like it was hard to breathe properly. I remember freezing. Her mother was there. She looked tired, empty. She didn't seem surprised or concerned that I was there. She didn't ask questions. She didn't tell me to leave. She just accepted it, like everything else in that space. I stood there, unsure of what to do. I felt uncomfortable, but I didn't want to be rude. I didn't want to embarrass my friend. I didn't understand what I was seeing yet, only that it felt wrong. Then her mother said dinner was ready. She didn't bring out plates. She didn't set a table. She grabbed a bag of dried dog food and dumped it onto the floor. And my friend and her siblings dropped to their knees and started eating it. Dry dog food, off the floor, no hesitation, no reaction, like this was normal. The image burned itself into my mind. I can still see it clearly, the sound of the food hitting the ground, the way they ate quickly, urgently, like they were afraid it might disappear, the way no one questioned it. I felt sick. I remember my chest tightening, my throat closing up. I didn't know how to process what I was seeing. I knew enough to understand that something was very wrong, but not enough to understand how deep it went. I said I had to leave. I don't even remember what excuse I gave. I just knew I needed to get out of there. I walked back to my grandmother and aunt, shaking, trying to explain through tears what I had seen. I told them about the food, about the floor, about how they were eating like animals. I don't know what happened after that. I don't know who they talked to or what actions were taken. I don't know if the authorities were called, or if family members intervened quietly, or if something else happened entirely. All I know is that I never saw her again. The next time we visited, she was gone. Her family was gone. The apartment was empty. No explanation was given to me, and I didn't ask. I think even then, some part of me understood that there were things adults didn't want children to know. But I never forgot her. As I grew older, the memory shifted. What once felt confusing began to feel horrifying. I started to understand what extreme poverty really looks like. I began to understand neglect, abuse, the way systems fail children completely. Years later, I learned the truth. She wasn't just living in poverty, she was being raped by her father. She got pregnant by him at 13 years old. When I found out, it felt like something broke inside me. Suddenly, everything made sense in the worst possible way. The filth, the hunger, the emptiness in her mother's eyes, the way she was so imaginative, so eager to escape into other worlds, the way she took control during our games, creating places where she had power and freedom. The father is in prison now, but the damage was already done. The last I heard, she was homeless. That fact still haunts me. She survived things no child should ever endure. And instead of safety, instead of healing, instead of support, she ended up on the streets. Another life chewed up and discarded by circumstances she never chose. I've tried to find her. I've asked cousins. I've followed rumors. I've reached out through people who might know her. Every attempt leads nowhere. Trails go cold. Names disappear. Lives slip through cracks so wide you could lose an entire human being inside them. I wish I could help her. I don't even know what that help would look like. Money wouldn't undo what happened. Words wouldn't fix it. But I wish I could do something, anything. I wish I could tell her that she mattered, that she still matters, that someone remembers her not as a statistic or a tragedy, but as a brilliant, imaginative little girl who led expeditions through the woods and dreamed up new worlds. I think about her a lot. I think about how unfair it is that my life turned out the way it did while hers didn't. How close we were in age. How easily our roles could have been reversed if circumstances were just slightly different. I think about how thin the line is between safety and horror. Sometimes I imagine what she would be like now, what kind of person she might have become if someone had protected her, if someone had stepped in sooner, if the world had been even a little kinder. I don't feel guilt exactly, but I feel something close to it, a kind of helpless sadness. The knowledge that loving memories can exist alongside unbearable truths, and that both can be real at the same time. She was my friend, and I carry her with me, not just as a story, but as a reminder of how much damage can hide behind closed doors, how easy it is for suffering to go unseen, and how important it is to pay attention when something feels wrong. I hope she's alive. I hope she's safe. I hope somehow that she has found moments of peace in a life that gave her so little of it. And if I never find her, if I never get the chance to help, I will still remember her as she was when we were kids, running through the woods, leading the way, creating worlds where we were free. That version of her deserves to be remembered, and I think about her a lot. My family almost never talked about the war, not in detail, not in a way that explained what it really meant to live through it. Growing up, I knew it existed the way you know a shadow exists, in a room without ever looking directly at it. It was there, always present, shaping everything quietly, but never named out loud. Only later did I realize that the silence itself was part of the story. My great-grandparents and grandparents lived through the Second Sino-Japanese War, and for them, it wasn't history. It wasn't something in books or documentaries. It was hunger, terror, and loss that carved itself into their lives so deeply that speaking about it felt impossible. The brutality they witnessed and endured was not something you could simply explain to someone who hadn't been there, so they didn't try. They survived. And survival became the priority. Remembering came second, if it came at all. Before the war, my family lived simply. They weren't wealthy, but they had food, routines, and the comfort of knowing what tomorrow would probably look like. Children grew up surrounded by siblings and cousins. Families were large, not because life was easy, but because that was how people protected themselves against loss. When sickness or accidents came, there were still others left. No one could have imagined how fragile that sense of safety really was. When Japan invaded China, everything changed quickly and violently. Cities fell, villages disappeared. People fled with whatever they could carry, often leaving behind generations of family history in the dirt. Roads filled with refugees. Hunger followed closely behind the violence. And once it arrived, it never really left. The invasion wasn't just about territory, it was about breaking people. My relatives lived during a time when fear became constant. Soldiers moved through towns with complete control, over the lives of civilians. There were no rules that protected ordinary people, no guarantee that women, children, or the elderly would be spared. You learned very quickly that being seen could be dangerous, and being heard could be worse. Some of my relatives were in or near Nanjing during the massacre. That fact alone carries a weight that's hard to describe. The rape of Nanking is known today as one of the worst atrocities of the war, but for my family, it wasn't a historical event. It was something that happened to people they knew, people they loved. Women were assaulted repeatedly. Some were killed afterward. Others were left alive to carry the trauma for the rest of their lives. Families were destroyed in ways that didn't always leave visible marks. Those who survived often did so because they hid, escaped, or were simply overlooked in the chaos. What's striking is not just what happened, but what came after. They never talked about it, not because it wasn't important, but because it was unbearable. There was no language for that kind of pain, especially in a culture where endurance and silence were often seen as strength. Talking about it wouldn't undo it. It wouldn't bring back the dead, and it might break the fragile control they had over their emotions. So they carried it quietly. China during the war was starving. Entire regions were stripped of food, either taken by occupying forces or destroyed during fighting. Farming became impossible in many places. Supply lines collapsed. Families survived on whatever they could find. Roots, bark, anything that could keep a body alive for one more day. Hunger wasn't a temporary discomfort. It was a constant companion. It shaped every decision. Children learned early that food was precious. Meals were small, irregular, and never guaranteed. Parents watched their children grow thinner and weaker, knowing there was nothing they could do to fix it. My grandmother was one of 10 children. 10. In a world where large families were normal, this wasn't unusual at first. But war doesn't care about what's normal. Disease spread easily among malnourished children. Infections that would have been survivable under normal conditions became deadly. Hunger weakened bodies to the point where even minor illnesses could kill. One by one, her siblings died, some from starvation, some from sickness, some from causes no one could fully explain, because when death is everywhere, it stops being investigated. You bury the body if you can. You mourn briefly if there's time. Then you move on, because stopping means risking your own life. Out of 10 children, only 2 survived. My grandmother was one of them. That number is staggering when you sit with it. 8 children lost. 8 lives erased before they had a chance to grow up. 8 personalities, futures, and possibilities gone. And yet, for my grandmother, this wasn't something she talked about in dramatic terms. It was simply a fact of her life. She survived because she had to. Survival during that time often came down to luck, timing, and small decisions that seemed meaningless in the moment. Being in the right place at the right time, avoiding a certain road, finding a little more food than someone else, getting sick later instead of sooner. There was no fairness to it. After the war ended, China didn't suddenly become peaceful or stable. The country was exhausted, broken. Families tried to rebuild while carrying unimaginable grief. People married, had children, and worked. But the past never truly stayed in the past. Trauma doesn't disappear just because fighting stops. For my grandmother and her parents, talking about what they had endured would have meant reopening wounds that never really healed. So they focused on the future, on rebuilding, on making sure the next generation had food, education, and some sense of stability. They showed love through action, not words. If my grandmother saved food, and it wasn't because she was stingy, it was because she remembered what it felt like to be starving. If she worried excessively about waste, it was because she had seen how quickly abundance could vanish. If she was emotionally reserved, it wasn't coldness, it was protection. The war shaped how she raised her children, even if she never spoke about it. Scarcity became a mindset, safety became something fragile. Trust in the world was limited, and the silence passed down too. As a child, I didn't hear stories about Nanjing. I didn't hear details about the famine. I just felt the echoes, the seriousness around food, the unspoken understanding that life could be taken away without warning, the respect for endurance over expression. Only later did I begin to understand that silence was not forgetfulness, it was survival. The people who lived through that level of violence often learned that remembering too clearly could destroy them. So they remembered just enough to stay cautious, to stay alive, to make better choices for their children. The women in my family who endured sexual violence carried that pain alone. In that era, there was no support, no language for trauma, no space to be vulnerable. Admitting what happened could bring shame, judgment, or worse, so they locked it away and continued living. That kind of strength is rarely celebrated because it doesn't look heroic, it looks quiet. It looks like getting up every day and functioning despite carrying unbearable memories. My grandmother lived her life without ever fully explaining what she had seen, but her survival speaks for itself. Being one of 2 out of 10 is not just a statistic. It's a testament to resilience shaped by circumstances no one should have to endure. When I think about her now, I don't just think about what she lost. I think about what she carried forward. She carried the memory of her siblings, even if she didn't say their names often. She carried the weight of history into a future that demanded she keep going. The Second Sino-Japanese War wasn't just brutal in the way wars are brutal. It was brutal because it targeted civilians, destroyed families, and left scars that lasted generations. It created survivors who learned to live with absence as a constant presence. My family is here today because some of them survived when most didn't. Because a young girl endured hunger, loss, and fear, and still lived long enough to build a family of her own. Because silence, as painful as it is sometimes became the only way to move forward. Even now, decades later, the effects of that war still exist in subtle ways, in how older generations relate to food, in how emotions are expressed or withheld, in how suffering is internalized rather than shared. The past didn't end with the war. It lived on inside the people who survived it. And every time I think about that, I realize how easy it is to forget that history isn't just dates and battles. It's families. It's children who didn't grow up. It's women who endured horrors and kept going anyway. It's grandparents who never spoke about what they lost, but built a future anyway. My grandmother was one of 2. That fact alone tells a story that words can never fully capture. The 2 sisters were known for being quiet long before anyone understood why. From the time they were very young, they barely spoke to anyone at all. Teachers noticed it first. Neighbors whispered about it. Doctors were confused by it. But what made their silence truly strange was that it wasn't complete. They spoke to each other, softly, privately, in a way no one else could ever hear or understand. When they were together, they had their own world. When they were apart, that world disappeared. The sisters were born only minutes apart, identical in every visible way. Same height, same face, same movements. Even their expressions mirrored each other so closely that people often felt uneasy watching them. It was like looking at a reflection that moved just a second too late. From early childhood, it became clear that their bond was intense, almost sealed off from the outside world. They would sit side by side for hours, whispering, staring, sometimes laughing quietly at nothing anyone else could see. But when adults spoke to them, the girls would freeze. They would lower their eyes, tense their bodies and refuse to answer. Days passed without a single word, then weeks, then months. Doctors were called. Psychologists observed them through glass windows. Teachers tried kindness, discipline, rewards, punishments. Nothing worked. The sisters remained silent to everyone except each other. People began calling them strange. Some called them stubborn. Others thought they were damaged. Their parents were desperate. They loved their daughters deeply, but they didn't know how to help them live in a world that required talking, responding, participating. Eventually, a decision was made that would change everything. Experts believed the girls were too dependent on each other. They said the twins had built a private language, an emotional shelter that kept them from growing as individuals. The solution, they claimed, was separation. If the sisters were forced to live apart, they would have no choice but to interact with others. They would learn to speak. They would be free. The parents agreed, though it broke their hearts. The twins were sent to 2 different boarding schools, far away from each other. On the day they were separated, witnesses said the girls clung to one another silently, their faces pale, their bodies shaking. They did not cry. They did not scream. They did not beg. They simply held on as if letting go would destroy them, and in a way, it did. Once separated, the sisters did not begin to speak. They did the opposite. They stopped eating properly. They stopped responding to instructions. They stopped reacting to the world around them. Their bodies were present, but their minds seemed locked somewhere far away. Doctors called it catatonia. They would sit or stand for hours without moving. If someone lifted their arm, it would stay in that position until gravity forced it down. Their eyes were open but unfocused. They did not respond to pain, to sound, to touch. It was as if the moment they were separated, something inside them shut down completely. Both girls were eventually removed from school and admitted to psychiatric hospitals. Even then, kept apart, the condition remained. They did not improve. Months passed. Years passed. Treatments came and went. Medications were tried. Therapies were attempted. Nothing reached them except each other. When the twins were finally reunited under controlled conditions, something changed. The catatonia eased slightly. They began whispering again. Not to doctors, not to nurses, only to each other. Whatever existed between them was stronger than medicine, stronger than isolation, stronger than fear. But it was also dangerous. Doctors grew worried. They believed the twins were trapped inside a shared identity, unable to exist as separate people. They feared the girls would never live independently, never form relationships, never function in society. As the sisters grew older, this fear became reality. They lived in institutions for years, barely speaking to anyone else. They were intelligent, creative, deeply emotional, but completely withdrawn from the outside world. They wrote together, created stories together, dreamed together, but always together. Eventually, they were transferred to a high-security psychiatric hospital, where they lived under constant observation. The doctors there tried something different. Instead of forcing them to speak, they encouraged communication in other ways. Writing, art, music. Slowly, painfully, the sisters began to express themselves more openly, but still as a unit rather than individuals. It was during this time that they made a decision that would shock everyone. The twins came to believe that only one of them could truly live. They spoke about it in whispers late at night, lying in identical beds, facing each other in the dim hospital light. They believed their bond was too strong, too complete. As long as both of them existed, neither could be free. But one of them had to let go so the other could step into the world alone. It was not a sudden idea. It was not emotional or dramatic. It was calm, thoughtful, planned. They discussed it for months. They talked about freedom, about what it meant to speak to others, about love, fear, and identity. They debated who was stronger, who was more capable of surviving alone. They weighed guilt and responsibility like adults far older than they were. Finally, they decided one of the sisters would die, the other would live. And when it happened, the survivor would speak, fully and openly, as proof that the sacrifice had meaning. No one knew about the pact. The hospital staff noticed nothing unusual in the days leading up to the event. The sisters were calm, peaceful even, cooperative. For the first time, they did not resist routine. They ate, they slept, they followed instructions. Doctors thought perhaps progress was finally being made. Then, one morning, everything ended. One of the twins collapsed suddenly. There were no signs of struggle, no wounds, no obvious cause. Doctors rushed to help, but it was too late. She was pronounced dead shortly after. An autopsy was performed. The cause of death was listed as inflammation of the heart. No toxins, no trauma, no clear explanation. Just a sudden failure, as if the body had quietly stopped. And then something even stranger happened. Moments after the time the sisters had planned, the surviving twin did something she had never done before. She spoke. Clear, calm, certain. "I'm free at last," she said. "Liberated. And at last, Jennifer has given up her life for me." The room went silent. Doctors and nurses stood frozen, unsure of what they had just heard. This was the first time the surviving sister had spoken openly to anyone outside her twin. Her voice was steady. There was no confusion in her eyes, no fear, no hesitation. She kept her promise. In the days that followed, she continued to speak. She answered questions. She expressed thoughts. She interacted with staff. The silence that had defined her entire life was gone. But the cost was unbearable. Some believed the death was a tragic coincidence. Others believed the bond between the twins was so powerful that the body followed the mind's decision. There was no evidence of suicide, no medical explanation that satisfied everyone. What remained was a haunting truth. Two lives so tightly connected that one could not exist fully without the other stepping aside. The surviving sister eventually left the hospital. She lived a quieter, more independent life. She spoke. She worked, she formed relationships, she carried guilt and grief, but also a strange sense of purpose. She had been freed, and the world was left wondering whether freedom was ever meant to come at such a price. For most of my life, this history barely existed to me, not in any real, meaningful way. I grew up in Canada, went through the public school system, learned about the country's founding myths, its wars overseas, its reputation for peacekeeping and politeness. I learned about Canada as a place that was supposed to be fair, tolerant, and humane. What I didn't learn, at least not properly, was what was happening inside this country to Indigenous children for generations. It wasn't until I was an adult that the residential school system truly entered my awareness. And even then, it came in fragments. An article here, a survivor's testimony there, a mention of the truth and reconciliation process that felt abstract and distant, like something happening in the background of national life rather than at its center. I understood, intellectually, that residential schools were bad, that children were taken from their families, that there was abuse. But understanding something in theory is very different from truly grasping its scale, its intent, and its lasting impact. Then the discovery in Kamloops happened, when the news broke that 215 children's remains had been found in unmarked graves at the former residential school in Kamloops, British Columbia. Something shifted. These were not rumors, not stories passed down and dismissed, not testimonies that could be ignored or softened. These were physical remains, evidence in the ground. Children who had names, families, and lives that were cut short and then erased. The school, known as the Kamloops Indian Residential School, had operated for decades. Decades during which children were taken, often forcibly, from their homes and placed into institutions designed not to educate them, but to strip them of their identity, to remove their language, their culture, their connection to family, their sense of self. The stated goal was assimilation. The reality was something far darker. The discovery of those graves made it impossible to look away. For survivors and indigenous communities, this was not new information. It was confirmation. Many had been saying for years, for decades, that children went missing and never came home, that classmates disappeared, that questions were never answered, that deaths were brushed aside, undocumented or deliberately concealed. Families were told nothing. Records were incomplete or destroyed. Grief was compounded by silence. For the rest of the country, especially people like me who had grown up largely unaware, it was a reckoning. Residential schools in Canada did not end in some distant, unrelatable past. They operated well into the late 20th century. While many people still believe they closed in the 1960s, the last federally run residential school did not close until the 1990s. That means there are survivors alive today who endured this system as children. It means this is not ancient history. It is living memory. That realization alone is deeply unsettling. These schools were not accidents. They were not isolated failures. They were part of a coordinated system funded and supported by the federal government and administered largely by churches. The intent was explicit: to kill the Indian in the child. This was not hidden language. It was stated openly by those who designed and ran the system. Children were taken, often under threat of punishment to their families. Parents who resisted could be jailed or have rations withheld. Once inside the schools, children were punished for speaking their own languages. They were beaten for practicing their culture. Many were subjected to physical, emotional, and sexual abuse. Malnutrition was common. Disease spread easily. Medical neglect was routine. And when children died, they were often buried in unmarked graves. The fact that 215 graves were found at Kamloops is horrifying on its own. But what makes it even more devastating is the understanding that this is likely only the beginning. Kamloops is one site among many. Residential schools existed across the country. Public pressure is now mounting on both the federal government and the churches involved to fund proper investigations, ground searches, and record disclosures. Each new discovery has the potential to reopen wounds, but it also brings long-denied truths into the light. For many survivors, the pain is layered. There is the trauma of what they endured as children. There is the lifelong impact of having their identity torn apart. And now there is the grief of seeing the world finally acknowledge what they have been saying all along, even as it confirms the worst possibilities. As someone raised in Canada, I find it deeply troubling how little this history was integrated into mainstream education. It wasn't hidden entirely, but it was minimized, sanitized, or framed as a regrettable but well-intentioned policy. The violence, the deaths, the systemic cruelty were not emphasized. The voices of survivors were not centered. Even when the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada released its findings, including detailed survivor testimonies and calls to action, it was easy for many people to treat it as something symbolic, something acknowledged briefly and then set aside. The discovery in Kamloops shattered that illusion. Bones in the ground are not symbolic, they are real. They belong to children who should have grown up, children who should have been protected, children who were instead placed into institutions that treated them as disposable. What makes this even harder to confront is the realization that previous attempts by survivors and their families to speak out were often ignored or dismissed. For years, people told these stories and were not believed. They were accused of exaggeration, of dwelling on the past, of trying to stir up division. The discovery of unmarked graves validates what survivors have always known, but it also raises painful questions about why it took physical evidence for so many people to finally listen. There is a particular cruelty in that delay. This discovery forces Canada and the world to confront a reality that clashes sharply with the country's self-image. Canada likes to see itself as different, better, kinder, more just. The truth is that colonial violence here was systematic, deliberate, and devastating. The residential school system was not a failure of good intentions. It was a tool of cultural genocide. That word makes people uncomfortable. But discomfort is not the same as injustice, and avoiding strong language does not make the harm disappear. As investigations continue, more sites will likely be examined. More unmarked graves may be found. Each one will represent another group of children who never came home, another community that carried unanswered questions for generations. This process will be painful. It will be emotionally exhausting, but it is necessary. Truth must come before reconciliation. Without a full accounting of what happened, reconciliation remains hollow. Apologies without action mean little. Acknowledgement without education allows the same patterns of ignorance to continue. One of the most important outcomes of these discoveries must be the integration of accurate, unfiltered history into Canada's education system. Children should grow up knowing the truth about residential schools, not as an aside, not as a footnote, but as a central part of understanding what this country is, how it was shaped, and whose suffering made its current form possible. Education is not about assigning guilt to future generations. It is about responsibility, about understanding how systems of power operate, about recognizing the warning signs of dehumanization so they can be challenged when they appear again. For Indigenous communities, the hope is not just that these truths will be acknowledged, but that meaningful change will follow. That funding for investigations will be provided without resistance, that records will be released fully and transparently, that survivors and families will be supported, not re-traumatized by bureaucratic obstacles. There is also a broader global significance to this moment. Residential schools were not unique to Canada. Similar systems existed in other settler colonial countries. What happens here sets a precedent for how nations deal with their darkest histories, whether they choose denial and defensiveness or honesty and accountability. This moment is a test. The discovery at Kamloops has already changed how many people see their country. It has forced conversations that can no longer be postponed. It has made it clear that the past is not past at all. It lives on in families, in communities, in ongoing disparities, and now, unmistakably, in the ground beneath our feet. For me personally, it has reshaped how I think about Canadian history. It has made me question what else I was never taught, what other stories were softened or omitted. It has made me more aware of how easily comfortable narratives are maintained when uncomfortable truths are allowed to fade. These children deserve more than brief headlines and momentary outrage. They deserve remembrance. They deserve truth. They deserve a country willing to look directly at what was done in its name. The discovery of those 215 unmarked graves is not just about the past. It is about the present and the future, about whether Canada is willing to move beyond symbolic gestures and commit to real accountability, about whether education will reflect reality rather than mythology, about whether survivors will finally be believed without needing to prove their pain through bones in the soil. As more investigations begin and more truths emerge, The hope is that this history will no longer be something learned too late, in fragments or by accident. It should be something known, acknowledged, and reflected upon openly, not to dwell endlessly in shame, but to ensure that silence, denial, and indifference are never again allowed to bury children and then forget them. These discoveries force us to listen, and this time we cannot look away. If you're still here, it means these stories didn't just pass through you, they stayed. Every story you heard tonight was real. Real people, real moments, and in every one of them, something went wrong, or almost did. If you want to keep exploring the stories that don't let go so easily, subscribe to Shadow Archives, because there are more stories waiting, and not all of them end before it's too late.